right, hey, I gave you the brain break, and let's do TikTok. The theme of today, so therefore, turn back into me, pay attention now. The theme of today is World War I at home, right? I gave you all the context of what's going on in Europe. Yesterday, I told you why we joined the actual war. Now, this is what was going on at home in America during that time. This is kind of a hodgepodge of some vocab terms that I'm going to explain one at a time. But if we weave it all together, this is what's going on in America during the time period of World War I. So think about it. There's a big conflict going on overseas. We're sending our boys over to fight. They're fighting and dying in the trenches. But we have a whole lot of politics and race relations and Supreme Court cases going on at home as well. So let's go ahead and get into that. First big thing we're going to talk about is the Espionage Act of 1917. Being as there's only 4 terms on your page today, there's plenty of space for your writing. I didn't put any tick marks or anything like that so as to mess you up. So really you should be, go ahead and write everything that comes across the screen. And if I say anything additional to help you take notes, by all means, write that down as well. Espionage Act. What year would you say it happened in?
1970.
Because it's in the name. So let's go ahead and place that in context of the war. When did the war start? When was the Archduke? Archduke was assassinated in 1914. But remember, Austrian assassinations don't affect us. We're isolationists for quite a while. Until the Zimmerman telegraph and Congress declares war when?
So, 1916.
1917. Go ahead. What you got? 1917. This basically coincides with America entering the war. So at the time that we enter the war, this law is passed, and I'll just simply define it. It's a law passed by Wilson during World War I, and it gave penalties for a variety of spying activities. Spying, sabotaging, taking photographs of military equipment and military bases. And here's kind of the one that maybe infringes upon freedom of speech rights. Anything that is deemed to obstruct the war effort, to include recruiting. So what we're going to have is a lot of people who speak out.
One thing that needs to be the Balfour representative, please make your way to the table in front of the media center. This is the last call.
Last call for Balfour. Anybody? All right. Jacket purchases. Pretty cool. What this is going to lead to is if you speak out against the war effort in the slightest, you could potentially be deemed as violating the Espionage Act. If you prevent recruits from going to the recruiting station, if you were to hold up signs in front of a recruiting station saying this is an unjust war, don't get involved in this war, that could be seen as, y'all go ahead, go ahead. That could be seen as being in violation of the Espionage Act. Do we, so what does that really potentially violate?
Freedom of speech.
Yeah, freedom of speech. This is not something that we super stand for as Americans, but politicians across time and in our U.S. history use war power acts, and they use the time of war as an opportunity to expand their own powers. Wilson is trying to say, hey, speaking out against the war effort is going to harm the war effort. That's why it's against the law. Not necessarily that it's like, oh, I'm going to infringe upon your freedom of speech. So a couple of posters that were popular in the day, I got them on the screen there. I pledge allegiance to the flag, and I pledge silence about the war. Hey, zip it, lock it, put it in your pocket. Don't harm the war effort. It was seen as unpatriotic to be going against the war effort. Now, what does that really hinder? If you wanted to talk about the war, if you wanted to bring up the flaws of the war, all of a sudden you are seen as an unpatriotic American. So it just really goes against the freedom of speech. Other one here, censored. Let's censor our conversation about the war. Now, it's got a letter on there, and that's saying, like, let's not send out information about troop movements, weapons capabilities, such like that. But it got expanded into the idea that if you oppose the war, if you were to say, son, I don't think you should join the military because this is an unjust war, well, all of a sudden, that could get you tripped up with the Espionage Act. That could get you declared a spy. A little bit more here. Congress passes the act in June of 1917. That's 2 months after we entered the war. So this is something that happened pretty immediately. It was something that the Wilson administration was on top of. They thought we can't fight this war if we don't also control the messaging. And after the war, see, our time in World War I was so brief, literally just about 18 months. So the violations of the Espionage Act, they actually never really made it to the court system till after the war was over. So the first violations of the law are going to start to be in the court systems shortly after the war was over. In a way, it's almost like we didn't prosecute these during the war, so how much did it affect the war? Well, it doesn't matter. Since it was a law in the books, we're gonna prosecute it inside of the court systems eventually. So I'll give you a chance to write that down. The big, the thing to remember here is that it was focused on activities that could be helping a foreign nation. It was seen as unpatriotic to speak out against the war because maybe that was helping a foreign nation.
I can't see. Okay, sure.
Yeah, questions?
What was that last thing you said?
Good. So it was seen as preventing foreign nations from gaining an advantage during our war effort. If you were to speak out against the war, you could be potentially giving information that would be beneficial to a foreign nation. Big idea is that it extended the reach of the federal government. It extended the power of Wilson. And this probably sounds a whole lot like what? Something we've already come through in U.S. history. Say it louder for the people in the back. Yeah.
John Adams.
And the
Sedition Act.
Excellent. Yeah. So this sounds a whole lot like something that happened about 150 years earlier under John Adams' presidency, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which also limited free speech, limited your ability to criticize the president. So that's really what this amounts to, is under the guise of espionage, right? Now, part of it is that you can't take photographs of military equipment, military bases, etc. But it's really just limiting you speaking out against the war effort. Wilson's going to war. He has decided to go to war. So anyone critical of that needs to be silenced. And this is what the Espionage Act does. I'm going to bypass this one because I've already said it. A couple of posters here that just kind of illustrate the point even more. Patriotism means no questions. Is that a motto we would stand for today?
No.
A lot of people think that patriotism means posing the questions, right? We've got to be willing to speak critically of the powers that be, or else they can do whatever they want unchecked. So that's a pretty bold statement right there.
Real posters?
These are real posters. Yeah, these are real posters from the time frame. These are propaganda posters. She said, are they supposed to be good posters? That depends on what you mean, what is good. But they're definitely propaganda posters. Okay. Trying to spread the message of be silent. Middle one there, tell no. Which one?
The middle one.
Tell nobody, not even her. So that's kind of direct.
Yeah.
That's directed at the soldiers. And it's saying, like, even your spouse, your girlfriend, your close significant other, don't tell anything about the war effort, even to her. And really, it kind of leads to the idea that she's going to spill the juice. If you tell her, she's going to tell her friends, and all of a sudden, the secrets are going to get out. So it is kind of getting into your personal life. It's saying, don't share this information, even with your spouse, even with your close significant other. And finally, the last one, pretty bold. Know your place, shut your face. That, and then whose hand is actually silencing the man?
Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam's, yeah. So big government overreach. Know your place, shut your face. Don't talk about the war effort. And what that really extends to, let me summarize it. I know I've said a lot of things in the past couple minutes. What that really gets to is the idea that you cannot be critical of the war effort. If you have a counter opinion, if you want to speak out against the war effort, you are seen as unpatriotic. And quite frankly, you can go to jail for it. Speak out against the war effort, and you're going to go to jail for it. Would that fly in the world today?
No.
Because everybody on Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN who has ever spoken out against the war in Afghanistan or Iraq could potentially be in jail over it. I'm saying, and that's not the case. Today, we encourage critical thinking. We encourage the media to be the watchdog of government, especially the watchdog of the president. And these days, just, if we were to ban speaking out against the president, like, people would be up in arms over it. It wouldn't go over because today we encourage speaking critically. So now has a thought?
These people.
Excuse me. These people just like get with it. Like, oh, if you know that.
Did these people just go with it? That's a great question. Let's find out. Obviously, there is a little bit more. Chandler said obviously not.
Like, does the average everyday person be like, you know what, let's just deal with it? Or
I don't know if it's obvious or not, but let me tell you the story. You don't need to bother to write this down. It's almost like I anticipated your question. Let me tell you about Charles Shank. Charles Shank is one of the first outspoken individuals to be charged with the crime related to the Espionage Act of 1917. Charles Shank is not one who is just going to go with it. If you want to write it down, by all means, but I'm telling you, this is a little bit of a side story. Charles Shank he actually circulated a flyer against the war effort right at the beginning of America getting involved. He was encouraging men to not sign up for the draft, not go to the recruiting station and volunteer for service. He called it an unjust war. He called it an imperialist war. He was saying the only reason we want to get involved is to gain more land, more power, more influence. More land, that's not the result of the war. Power, influence, money, I'll hear that a little bit. Like, we did gain that. But his idea, or his big gripe, was that America does not have the intentions of protecting Europe. America has the intentions of spreading its imperialistic intentions all over the world. Right or wrong, and you can certainly read more about it, debate about it, Charles Shank is the first one to actually be charged with the crime under the Espionage Act. The court, however, upholds his conviction. The court says it was wartime conditions. That means that there was a danger, potentially a danger inside of the country, and therefore the Espionage Act was justified. So Charles Shank's conviction was upheld inside the court of law. Charles Shank is kind of on the small side. This next guy is on your page. This is Eugene Debs. So there's Eugene Debs. Okay, there's a picture of him. You got a picture on your page as well. It's kind of a really interesting picture I'll tell you about here in just a second. Eugene Debs was a prominent socialist. I'm going to define socialism for you here in just a second, but suffice it to say, socialists are anti-capitalism. Socialists are for the laboring man and very much against the wealthy people who have a lot. Eugene Debs was actually, some of his writing really spoke out against Andrew Carnegie and his so-called philanthropy. I've actually read a little bit of Eugene Debs' writing, and he actually kind of mocks Andrew Carnegie and his philanthropy. Philanthropy, of course, we believe to be a good thing, giving money away. But he says Andrew Carnegie is so rich that him giving away money isn't really out of the goodness of his heart. He's just trying to make himself look better. So he mocks rich people, and he even mocks people who give their money away. He's a very outspoken critic of World War I. The picture, you can tell he's like giving a very emphatic speech. So he held rallies, he gave speeches, he would stand on the steps of City Hall and speak at whoever would listen to him against the war effort. He also was in the same camp as Charles Shank, where he thought it was an imperialistic effort. He thought it was to help the rich get richer. He did not think it was about protecting European interests or anything like that. And he is arrested and actually is sentenced to 10 years in jail under the Espionage Act. Very similar to Charles Shank's conviction being upheld, Debs' conviction is upheld in a similar fashion. It's because the court says that the Espionage Act is legal because it's a time of war. If it was not a time of war, that might not be the case. It probably wouldn't have been the case. It would have been deemed unconstitutional, infringing upon your freedom of speech. But because it was in a time of war, it was a lawful action. It was a lawful Espionage Act. Again, would be pretty controversial today, even in a time of war. I'm not sure our Congress would pass something like the Espionage Act, but at the time period, that's how it was justified. Here's a picture of Debs. So Debs actually ran for president 5 different times. He ran for president as a socialist. And we're going to talk socialism here in just a second. But he runs as the Socialist Party of America's candidate for president in 1904, 1908, 1912. So that's leading up to World War I. And then in 1920, he runs for president from prison. He is in jail. Okay, he's been put in jail by the Wilson administration. And he runs for president from prison. And you can see his campaign button right there. It says, "For president, convict number 9653. I guess
It's
that
not
was
hard.
probably his jail number. Now, a very interesting little loophole in, I suppose, the American election system. He was able to run for president. It wasn't as a convicted felon, he was not allowed to vote, but he was still able to run for office and literally run for president. So he received upwards of 1 million votes as a candidate for president in prison.
How many votes?
1 million.
That's a lot.
1 million votes. It's a lot of individual votes, but he did not get any electoral votes. He did not carry any entire state. But it's a lot of individual votes. It was. So very interesting. Did you say it was fire? Pretty fire that he could run for jail or run for office from prison. Yep. Now let me finish his story for you. He was given a 10-year sentence in 1919. So that would have taken it to 1929. He was pardoned in 1921. Served about 2.5 years of his sentence. The new president, not Wilson, but the next guy, which is President Harding, we're not going to talk much about him. He pardons Eugene Debs. Debs was in poor health, right? It wasn't a good look for the country to have put this man in jail. Basically, what was necessary in a time of war, the Espionage Act, was not necessary after the war. So, much like sometimes popular criminals start to have these campaigns to earn a pardon, Debs earned a pardon, or he was given a pardon by Harding in 1921. He dies in 1926. So he lives a couple more years as a free man. He dies in 1926. So
this act went out.
yes, the
and then
action.
he got out of
That's
jail.
right. The action expired at the end of World War I, and it was no longer the case outside of wartime conditions. Good point, Chandler. It's not something that did not become part of our Constitution. It's not a law to this day. It was just something that was inside of World War I, and it was justified. I mean, it was a presidential overreach. Like that picture of Uncle Sam cupping your mouth, it was definitely a government overreach, but it was justified because of wartime conditions. We're going to see the same come World War II. We're going to see the president and the government kind of extend their power inside of World War II conditions as well. So hang on to that idea. You're going to be disgusted. I'm going to make a prediction that you're going to be disgusted by some of the things your government has done and did do during World War II. All right, here's the definition of socialism, and we're going to contrast this with communism in a future class. But socialism, here's just kind of the flat definition. A form of government which the government owns and controls resources and businesses. The reason the government owns and controls resources and businesses is to evenly distribute it to people in need. Under socialism, there's not a super wealthy class, and ideally, there's not a super poor class. Everybody has similar resources. Socialism does away with everything. We do not live under socialism. We live under capitalism. Capitalism is where you can have a business, you can set your own prices. If your business does well, you earn a lot of money. If your business does poorly, you might have to close your business, but you earn your own destiny. That's capitalism. Socialism says nobody should be super rich. Nobody should be poor and on the streets. We should all be about even, right? I'm putting it in simple terms. There's a lot of academic thought that goes into all these government philosophies. But Debs was a socialist. The socialism was on the rise in the country at the time. Now, who would oppose socialism?
The wealthy people.
The wealthy people, rich people, business owners, and for starters. Who would be in favor of socialism? The working class, poor people. Now, unfortunately, what socialism turns into is that those in the ruling class, they are still a cut above. They may pretend like they have the best interests of everybody in mind, but socialism in action has literally never worked. If you want to take a look at a country that's socialist right now and is failing, look at the country of Venezuela. Look at the island nation of Cuba. These are socialist countries that are utterly failing. They don't have even resources all across the board where everybody's living in some great little utopia. They have a super poor class and they have a powerful ruling class. And they also lack a lot of resources based off of government overreach. So you want to go to the grocery store in a socialist country, you're going to have a lot of bare shelves. I digress. We got into this a little bit at the tail end of world history, but this is socialism. Now, I see a hand in the back. Is that Hayden? Did you have a question?
No.
You did, but I answered it. Something like that? Okay, cool. So here's Eugene Debs in prison. This is actually the same photograph that goes into that button. You can see he was kind of in a posh prison, right? He had nicer clothing. He was able to walk around the yard. He even was still able to pose for some photographs, give some interviews, give some speeches. He was, for lack of a better term, he was a political prisoner. They were not going to put him in solitary confinement. They were not going to feed him poor food. He was going to be taken care of. And of course, eventually he received his pardon anyway. So let's look at a couple of Eugene Debs quotes. And I will leave it to you to kind of think about, his influence and whether he was right or wrong, whether Wilson was right or wrong. Here's one of Eugene Debs' quotes. While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. So who's he in favor of? Poor people. It's another group that he's maybe in favor of.
The criminals?
Just people that
Yeah.
are outspoken.
The oppressed people. I think he's in favor of oppressed people. You say criminals. I think his quote there speaks to people who are wrongly imprisoned. Certainly there are people who do crimes and need to be in prison. His quote there is kind of speaking to those who are wrongly imprisoned. Here's another quote. I have no country to fight for. My country is the earth, and I am a citizen of the world.
Okay.
What do you think he means by that?
No, like he's like, he doesn't stand for just like one country, he stands for like all people.
He wants
Yeah.
peace.
World peace. Okay, I like that phrase, world peace.
He's
Um,
not a nationalist.
Yeah, he's not a nationalist, right? He's not a nativist for sure. He says, I belong to humankind. So bit of a big fluffy idea, and a lot of times, I'll agree that some of these sentiments sound nice, but socialism in practice has actually never really worked out. There still is a ruling class, and there is an oppressed class. So that's kind of something a little bit more for a government class than a U.S. history class. But I just like breaking down these quotes and seeing what these people were all about. One more quote here. This is pretty spicy. The most heroic word in all of languages is revolution. What do you mean by that?
He's calling it the Indian Revolution.
Honestly, I think it kind of goes against the second quote, to be honest.
Goes against the second quote.
Yeah.
How so?
He's trying to like, he was saying how he's just kind of like, for the people, the world, or whatever, but like revolution. I mean, yeah, I see what he's saying, like it's the most heroic of all the languages. But like, yes.
Who do you think he was going to take on?
He just wants to change.
Who's not a part of his family?
Maybe it was supposed to be a socialist, so maybe capitalists.
Take on the capitalists? Yeah. If he says, I'm a citizen of the world, that's kind of like this big kumbaya statement. Everybody's on my team. But I bet there's one group that's not on his team. Who do you think?
The Germans?
Germans, I hear that. What'd you say? The guy who made the action, Wilson. Yeah. So Jacqueline, actually, that gets right to what I was going to say is the elected groups, the elected leaders, which Wilson, of course, is one of those. So he's going to be all kumbaya with the oppressed groups of the world, but he is not going to be a part of the elected leaders or those who are doing the oppressing. So his whole statements are more than just this. I don't want to cherry pick 3 quotes and have you have you think that he's some heroic individual. He is a complicated man for sure. And actually, we still, when I say socialist, do you think that there are still socialists in the world today?
Yeah.
There are. Do you think that there are socialists in your government today?
Yeah.
There are. Name them.
I don't know. I don't know much. Oh yeah, he is actually.
Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont, is a Democratic socialist. He started his career belonging to this little extra now. I'm trying to bring it to today. He started on the right hand side. That's Eugene Debs. Okay, that's a little bit of a younger picture. But on the left hand side, that is Bernie Sanders. He started his career as a Democrat, but he even has departed from the Democrat Party. He calls himself a Democratic Socialist. Really, it just means a socialist. He does believe in socialism. Man, how old is he? In the 80s? There is I don't have a picture for this, but there is another younger looking Democratic socialist, and what is her name?
Her?
Her name.
The vice president?
No, that's not hers.
No, she's from New York.
Kelly.
AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She is.
I did.
I can't deal with Kelly Clarkson. AOC, I don't have a picture of her, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's in her 20s. She's a congresswoman from New York City. She is an outspoken, self-declared socialist. So socialism is not dead. It's also not a bad word. Sometimes we're like, ooh, socialism. It's a political idea. Sometimes it is, well, many times it has been proven to not work. But it's not, it doesn't mean you're a sinner. It doesn't mean you're a heathen. It doesn't mean you're going to hell. Socialism is just a political idea in which the government controls the means of production and shares it with everybody. Hard to get it to actually work because there's human nature involved, but that's what is socialism. So, hung out on socialism a little bit longer than I thought I would. Let's move on to the Great Migration. Okay.
Next time,
I love
get a young
suggestions.
picture of Bernie.
Huh?
Get a young picture of Bernie.
Okay.
Okay. No, that's not Bernie.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, that's not, no, that's Debs on the right. And,
Oh, well,
Bernie's hot.
no, I'm sorry, I should label him.
They kind of do.
This is the guy we talked about, Eugene Debs.
Oh, really?
This is old Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, maybe you should label that.
Okay, all right, that's fair, that's fair, that's fair.
No, Bernie was hot.
All right, so like I said, kind of piecemealing some of these topics together, moving right along to, this is in the same time period as the World War I, but it's something that's going on at home, not overseas. It is called the Great Migration. So write this down. This is pretty much like the verbatim definition. Great Migration happened between 1915, so that puts us in the war years, extending all the way into 1940. So, I mean, that takes us outside of this time period a little bit, but that's how, that migrations don't just happen like that. They are movements over time. And what it is the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the South to the North, from the rural plantations of the South to the urban cities of the North. It's as if they are finally leaving the place that they got brought to for the purpose of slavery. And they are taking their own destiny into their own hands, and they are traveling to
So
the
they
North.
weren't moved?
They were not moved. No, they choose to move. Just think like birds move from south to north for the wintertime. That's a migration. Same idea here. The African American people group, and that's not to say every one of them, but a large number of African Americans moved from the south to the north for many reasons, and the reasons are what I'm about to tell you. You can see the picture there. This is true photography from the time period. A lot of times they just packed up everything they had into the best vehicle they could find, whether it was well maintained or not. They tried to make the drive to the north. A lot of times the vehicle would break down on the side of the road. They continue walking. They take a suitcase in hand and they would walk as far as they could. Because they are that committed to leaving the rural plantation society and moving to a place where there were better opportunities. So now I'm going to tell you why they moved, and I'm going to explain it. I'm going to explain it in kind of academic terms, and I want you to think about this. This could apply to a lot of things. Anytime you make a decision, there are two things going on. One is called a push factor. That is what pushes you to that decision. The other is the pull factor. That's what draws you in to that decision. So some things pushed the African Americans out of the South. Other things pulled them into the North. It's almost like to say there's reasons on both sides. Pros, cons is another way you might think of it. What pushed them out of the South? What pulled them to the North? So the push factors are this: poor economic conditions in the South. Limitations of sharecropping, right, is the system that was almost like slavery. Farm failures, and this is a really quirky part of U.S. history, and we don't elaborate on it too much. But there's an insect called the boll weevil, and the boll weevil. Have you read about it? Eighth or younger? All right. So the boll weevil by itself was actually very impactful on American farming, and it is one of the reasons. Right? It's hard to say that a bug did this, but it is one of the reasons that African Americans leave the South, go to the North. Another big push factor, and this one is probably a little bit more common sense to you, the Jim Crow laws that were prevalent in the South. Some people finally said, enough of that. Like, why would I stay in the South? Let's go to the North. Took a lot for them to do that because the South is everything they had known. Their homes are there. Their families are there. At least they're making a living, even if it's not a good one. If we're going to go to the North, where are we going to live? What jobs are we going to have? How are they going to treat us? But some courageous people said, we out. We are leaving the South and all of its Jim Crow laws behind. We're going north. So these are factors that push them out of the South. But there are also things in the North that pulled them in, almost like advantages of the North. What would pull them in to the North? So I'm going to pause for a second, make sure you guys got all the push factors written. You guys kind of understand push and pull? Pushed them out of the South, pulled them into the North? Nope, not that. Not that. One of those TikTok words I don't understand. All right, here's the pull factors. So at first, they, with the lack of communication between regions of the country, with sectionalism, if you will, even though we're outside of the Civil War, there's still sectioned portions of the country. A lot of African Americans didn't even know that there were better opportunities up north. A lot of them thought that the North was this great unknown. Oh wow, the North. We're never going to go north because we don't belong there. Well, guess what? Finally, the message of good wages and good living conditions started to trickle down to the South. And that's because there were a series of black-specific newspapers that carried messages that would relate specifically to African Americans. They started to publish these messages that, hey, African Americans, there's good opportunities up north. You should come up north. Hey, when you come up north, there's going to be a job for you. There's going to be a house for you. And guess what? They treat us a lot better up here. Jim Crow laws only apply to these southern states. How about you pack up your bags and come try? So these newspapers were really influential of getting people to come to the north. And finally, I think it's on there. Yep, firsthand stories. Cousin Jimmy, right? He left Alabama. He goes to Massachusetts. He lives in Massachusetts for 6 months. Time to come visit home. Cousin Jimmy comes back to Alabama, and what kind of stories does he have? Good ones. So word of mouth. That's the slowest way to spread a message is word of mouth. But his word of mouth messages started to spread the good news that, hey, up north is not so bad. In fact, you should come and try it out. So newspapers, firsthand stories, positive stories of money, positive stories of employment are the reasons that people would be drawn to the north. Push to the north. But can I turn that off? Is there a way to turn that off?
I think you need to turn your ringer on.
Because that bugs me all the time.
It doesn't to me. Hey Siri.
Right?
Hey Siri.
It's not even haste. It's like I'm talking to my watch now. Can I ask you a question about westward migration? It'll do it at random times. I can't even figure out when.
Turn it off on the Apple app.
Hey Siri, can't even figure out
Hey
when or what.
Siri.
Here's an example of a newspaper. This is called the Chicago Defender, and it is one of those black-specific newspapers. And you can see that it's publishing stories in favor of the Great Migration. Right. All right. Here's a map, and I got to explain this to you. Every time we see a map, we got to look at the key. So I see two distinctly different types of arrows. So I go to my key. What is referencing the Great Migration? The green dots. So if I look at this map, I also realize there's a second migration, and that's not what I'm talking about right now.
Oh, no.
Okay, yeah. So let's look at the Great Migration. We can see that from the south to the north, these are the various paths that most African Americans followed. Where did they go? Generally speaking. So I see Chicago, I see Detroit, Cleveland, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Norfolk, Virginia. What are those? What are those? Big cities. Industrial big cities. Where there are
Factories.
Yeah, factories have jobs. Yeah. So they weren't going to the middle of nowhere, Scranton, Pennsylvania. They were going to the big cities. Now, Christy points out there's a minority that went further south, Houston, Texas, south of Florida, whatever. But by and large, from the south to the north to these major industrial cities. We'll talk about this whole second movement later. I don't even want to confuse you. We're right here. Yeah, I feel like Vanna White. I feel like a weatherman.
Vanna White.
All right, I'm gonna finish off our conversation here, and then we'll get to the sandwich part of our booklet. I want to read to you a quote about the Great Migration. So, hey, hear me on this. Kind of a serious quote. You got to tuck you to listen to it. And the reason I want to read this to you is because for some of you, this is your story. For some of you, this is the reason that your family story exists to this day. I know we're in the South, we're in Georgia, but the rise of the influence of African Americans starts in this time period, and I want you to hear this quote. I want you to hear it well. So I'm gonna put it on the screen, but I'm gonna read from my paper here. Merely by leaving, African Americans would get to participate in democracy, and by their presence, force the North to pay attention to the injustices in the South and the increasingly organized fight against those injustices. By leaving, they were changing the course of their lives and those of their children. They would become Richard Wright, the novelist, instead of Richard Wright, the sharecropper. They would become John Coltrane, jazz musician, instead of Taylor. Bill Russell, NBA pioneer, instead of paper mill worker. Zora Neale Hurston, beloved folklorist, instead of maidservant. The children of the Great Migration would reshape professions that, had their families not left, may have never been open to them. From sports and music to literature and art. Miles Davis, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, August Wilson, Jacob Lawrence, Diana Ross, Tupac Shakur, Prince, Michael Jackson, Shonda Rhimes, Venus and Serena Williams, and countless others. The people who migrated became the forebearers of most African Americans born in the North and the West. What is this saying? If they hadn't have moved, who knows what opportunities they would or would not have happened in the future. So I read off a list of names, obviously famous names. I feel that contrast. Bill Russell, who was an NBA Hall of Famer, African American, he might have only ever been a sharecropper. Artists and novelists might have only ever been maidservants. Shonda Rhimes, Grey's Anatomy, right? Who knows what she would have gone on to do or not do had these people not had the courage to go from south to north. So the Great Migration really sets up the history of what becomes 2022. Any thoughts on that? Any hot takes? All right, now I want to make this clear. Today we talked about the Great Migration, not the westward migration. Another term in our unit, and we're going to talk about it inside of the Great Depression, is the westward migration. Today we talked about the Great Migration, not the westward migration. So let's finish off our sandwich portion of Look It. I'm going to pull up Look It again, and having talked about some of this, you should be able to play the game a little faster.
Yeah, let's not do
Yeah,
that.
what do you want to do?
Let's do
Cyber.
Cyber?
No, I don't care. Whatever they want.
Hey, my Chromebook ain't coming on.
Hey, I can't
Well,
fix
that's the
that.
problem.
Oh, we can't.
Where's your hat?
Oh, I just
Hey, can I take something?
wasn't me.
Let's go!